There's a saying that goes, sometimes you find yourself in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes in the middle of nowhere, you find yourself. One of the most pivotal parts of an archetypical pilgrimage comes somewhere in the middle, when you are furthest from anything that seems familiar. When you're tired, confused, lonely, maybe even lost. When you're at your most vulnerable, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I think that time of profound vulnerability might be why there are so many teachings in the Bible, far more than just the two we heard, that tell us about caring for the stranger. Again and again, we're told to connect to our own deep memories of being an alien and be moved to compassion when we see that in someone else. And to know that you and the stranger, your places might well be reversed someday. Don't forget. And when we're in the middle of nowhere and no one can see us, that's when we find out who we really are. Now, that's true for both the stranger and for the one who receives them, or at least the one who could. We're told that offering someone welcome in that moment of vulnerable need is a deeply spiritual act. Many people have been taken advantage of, deceived, hurt, even killed in that moment. Doing the opposite, offering assistance or more so radical hospitality, I believe is just the sort of countercultural act that is at the core of God's message and God's call. Seeing someone who might dress, speak, or act differently, and recognizing, more importantly, that they are family. Maybe not familiar, but spiritual family related to us deep down at the core. To find familiarity in someone who might at first appear strange. And I also believe that being that so-called alien, being in that moment of vulnerability and accepting help, is receiving God. It can be tempting to close off, to pretend things are okay, to persist on alone, not to be willing to ask for directions, so to speak. It is spiritual to trust strangers, to recognize that familiar desire to help in those strange circumstances, to perhaps understand a gesture as help, even if it comes in a strange form. These Bible passages also remind us not to feel too secure when we're the helper, to remember that the line between foreigner and citizen is a matter of luck, maybe an accident of birth, and often just a matter of time before we're in that other role. The very act of being willing to take risks and go on a journey and to be seen as alien or strange can be a sign of faith. Many people try to avoid the unfamiliar at all costs. But being a person of faith is often referred to as being a pilgrim or a wanderer. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel says, "Faith is not clinging to a shrine, but an endless pilgrimage of the heart." So often we hear that our faith sends us out to serve, to be cast out from places of comfort. Yet we also know that we have a deep spiritual yearning for a sense of home. In Work for Justice, we often talk about the deep restlessness that comes from seeing the world as it is, that propels us and fuels our work, moves us out of stasis and cynicism and towards hope and home in the possibility of what could be. When I was in seminary in Toronto, I got to do an internship in the Philippines, hosted by the National Council of Churches of the Philippines. My wife Kelly and I got to be the very first same-sex couple that they had ever received, and they were so gracious. In many ways, it was wonderful. The Protestant churches in the Philippines are known for their prophetic work for justice and politically engaged faith. It's also not surprising to see Catholic nuns in their habits on the front lines of protests for justice. In the Philippines, people were so kind to us, so generous, and so patient. So willing to accommodate our sensitive stomachs that struggled with the water, and our skin that seemed to be always red with sunburn and simultaneously shiny with sweat. And for us, things that at first seemed strange and confusing because of this kindness quickly became familiar. We were so grateful that despite all of the work they had, so many people were willing to spend time with us and share their stories. Despite colonialism and racism and the many people who looked like us who had come in the past, our hosts were willing to trust us and entrust us with their truth. However, one element of the internship that was pretty hard was that we were often hosted by a different organization every few days, and even more so, generally a different host family every single night. And this came out of generosity. Our hosts really wanted to maximize our learning, and so many people were wanted to host us. And in the beginning, like most pilgrimages, most trips, it was all wonderful. It was a privilege to meet so many people, to learn so much, to see so much. But as you might imagine, after a few months of these constant changes, we became lonely. All the people we met were wonderful, but it was hard not to be able to go very deep in conversation and to have to basically start at square one every day, telling people about the weather in Canada, the food in Canada, what snow was like, and whether we had it all year. Sure, cultural differences can be challenging, but a lot of them were just kind of funny, like having strangers come up to me to pet my arm hair. But we really knew it was such a privilege to be there and learn, to travel to so many cities and different islands, to more places than many Filipinos had even been in their own homeland. But then there was that moment when it all became just a bit too much. Toward the end of our internship, we moved out of the capital region around Manila to the island of Mindanao in the south, in some very rural areas. The bits of Tagalog that we had managed to learn were no longer useful because in the south they speak Visayan, totally different. Everything we learned about navigating cities no longer applied. We couldn't get around on our own, and we got sick. Our newly assigned guides were these 17-year-olds who saw us as the embodiment of Western imperialism. And because of their newfound social analysis, though not wrong, they really didn't seem that interested in helping us. We often had no idea where they were, and because of that, no idea where we were. One day, as we were sitting out in the shade of a fruit tree, waiting for our guides to reappear, probably feeling a bit sorry for ourselves, a woman came up with a cartload of vegetables. She smiled and started giving them to us, loading them right into our arms. As often happened on that trip, we were confused. Was she selling these to us? Did she just want us to hold them? We had nothing we could do with them and nowhere to put them, really. We didn't even know what most of these vegetables were called. It was confusing, and our guides, as I said, hadn't been around for a few hours. And we had no idea how to interpret this other than to just smile and to say thank you. But eventually, someone managed to translate that the woman with the vegetables had been an overseas worker, a nanny, for many years in the Middle East. She saw us, and she remembered feeling very lonely and thought maybe we were lonely. And what she had were the vegetables from her garden. She knew the gift wasn't practical, but she saw us and she knew. She recognized what we were feeling. She looked at our strange faces and felt the pang of familiarity with her heart. I felt so seen in that moment, known and cared for and welcomed. Despite having no shared language, she saw us and understood. She had been a foreigner, and she knew what it was like. Even though, of course, our experience as privileged white women on an internship was so different from hers, she knew what it was like to be far from home. And her compassion moved her to act, to do what she could to show she cared. Despite all of these differences between our lives, she saw us and in turn made us feel seen. Even though it is truly beautiful and spiritual when someone remembers their own experience as a stranger and is moved by that to offer welcome, sometimes I struggle a little bit with the way the Bible seems to phrase the care for foreigners. Sometimes it seems a bit like it's saying, if you know what it's like to be a stranger, then you should care. Or maybe it's okay to assume that your experience is the same as someone else's, to assume you know what they need. But really, I don't think these passages are about the specifics of helping. Instead, I think they are saying that we need to tap into the deep memories of struggle from our own lives so that we're doing what's right, so that we're motivated to help, not only by our minds, but that we are remembering how crucial it is with our heart. And to say that we can't set up a boundary between ourselves, safe and secure, and even maybe superior as the helper, and the foreigner out there as the needy one to be helped. Remember that any border or boundary is an illusion, and a stranger's suffering is your own. Don't be smug or self-righteous. You may well be that foreigner needing help sooner than you know. Even though I had the great privilege of choosing to travel to the Philippines and being shown hospitality by so many people, many Filipinos and many other people of other nationalities are forced to leave their countries and travel for many different reasons. I remember meeting one woman who told me how she spent decades away from her own children in the Philippines in order to raise other people's kids as a nanny in Hong Kong. How even though she was badly treated and forced to work 7 days a week and live in a space that was basically a closet, she had to keep working because her employment agency had kept her passport, and besides, she was indebted to them for her plane ticket and work visa. Working overseas was the hope of her family, and she needed the job to pay for her kids' school fees and parents' medications. But she was able to get out of the situation because of her own faith and those motivated by their faith to help. And once back at home, she became involved with an organization for overseas Filipino workers called Migrante. Migrante was founded by Filipinos who had worked overseas and knew very much what it was like to be an alien in a foreign land. But rather than forget that experience and put it behind them, they actively worked to remember that experience. They put their memories into service to literally save the lives of those who are in these most vulnerable situations. Often migrant workers are easy targets for criminal accusations, and they have the least legal protections. Migrante has set up hotlines, and they advocate for workers who are caught in international limbo. They provide education about labor rights. They do what they can to support those who must travel for work. Experiences of being a pilgrim in a strange land can truly open our hearts. They can lead us to this compassion. But I don't believe it's essential to be a stranger in order to have this understanding. I think we can be moved by the stories of others just as well as experiences. Listening deeply to someone's truth can take us on that kind of journey outside of ourselves. We can be brought along and brought into someone's pain if we are open enough to be moved. For me, I think one of the most important practices of faith is keeping our hearts soft and tender. Like soil, we dry out if we're left in the sun. We need to keep watering and tilling and tending to the gardens of our hearts. In ancient times, people ridiculed the early Christian communities. The philosopher Lucian is recorded as calling these early Christians gullible. Their reputation for being gullible was because they were willing to give what they had to people they didn't know, to strangers. And I think of that gullibility as kind of a compliment. It's so easy to have your heart hardened by this world, to become skeptical, to close off your mind and your heart and your wallet. Of course, we don't want to get truly harmed in helping, but I think it can be easy to err too hard on the side of being protective as well. We don't have to travel anywhere to see our own lives and the world differently. For me, I've always loved the description of anthropology that it is a process of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And I think faith can do something that is much the same, to see the world in new ways. Mary Jo Letty, who's a theologian who has worked for decades with refugees, tells a really moving story of a newly arrived woman who was going to be staying in one of the houses that she helped to run. Mary Jo was giving the woman a tour and showing her around when the woman pointed to the backyard and asked who lived there. At first, Mary Jo was very confused and thought it might be because of a language difference. But it turned out eventually that the difference was not one of language, but one of culture, one of priorities. It turned out that the space in the backyard that the woman was asking about was the garage. Mary Jo recalls having to answer with some shame that that was actually a house for a car, not a house for a person. No one lived there. That despite there being people who desperately needed homes, that building's sole purpose was to house a car. I think that is such a moving example of the familiar becoming strange. Something like a garage that we take for granted as being completely normal, being shaken by someone who is not conditioned to see it that way. So often we do talk about needing to see the strange as familiar, to see people or places or situations that we might see as distant or disconnected as valuable and valid and good and holy, and that is important. But I think we also need to be ready to see the things we too easily take for granted about ourselves and our lives for what they truly are, which may be in fact something strange and not totally in line with our truest values. Today, my friends, you may be listening and feel secure and at home in your life and your faith, or you may not. You may know that deep sense of longing for home, and you may be on your own journey across borders of space, borders of identity or belief. And wherever you may be, you can know that you are not alone. The struggle of one person is the struggle of all. Our lives, both spiritually and practically, are pilgrim lives with so many stops along the way. These stops sometimes feel familiar and safe, and other times they are difficult and totally disorienting. And if you're at a stop right now that feels stable, don't forget about those harder times. Use those memories to fuel your heart and step out and reach out as you can. Whatever strange exteriors or appearances you may encounter, chances are that there is something familiar just below the surface. And if today, as you're listening, you feel unmoored or uprooted, a lonely pilgrim far from home, know that we collectively are with you. This suffering is not God's will, and there is a rest stop for you, if not a home, just a few more steps ahead. The journey of life is long and winding, but it has been traveled before. There wouldn't be such a strong theme about the foreigner and the alien in the Bible if so many people had not walked in your shoes. It may feel as though you have been forgotten, but God never forgets. Some of us with privilege or who just happen to be doing well right now, we might want to set up boundaries that will make you feel even more alone. But so many of us have been where you are. And when we're at our best, we do remember that. We do know. Strangeness is mostly an illusion, and familiarity, or more so, our human familial tie, is what is most real. We are called, my friends, to journey together, to hold the Christ light for each other when we stumble, and to leave the porch light on so we can all make it safely home. So many of the borders and boundaries of our world are truly just an illusion. And although diversity and difference is a gift, connection is what is truest and what will ultimately endure. I do believe that God is with us at every step of our lives, and God is the pathway, the companion, and the destination where we are fully welcomed, fully loved, and fully known. For this and so much more, thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen.